You're listening to the Perth Property Show, Australia's only weekly property podcast by West Australian experts for West Australian listeners. Catch your latest episode every Monday at 7 a.m.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Perth Property Show. My name's Trent Fleskens, your host as always. And what a special, long-awaited episode this one is. Sometimes things happen for a reason, and it's a great time to have a conversation with our Minister for Planning and Housing. And I think I'm missing a couple more in the infrastructure space as well that you might remind me of, Minister, to have a conversation around how our state's going in the housing space, and planning leads into housing too, and what the future looks like in that planning space as well. Minister Carey, thanks so much for coming in. It means a lot to me, and I know it means a lot to the thousands that listen to this podcast weekly.
Trent, it's always a pleasure, I have to say. I know a lot of people listen to this, and I do listen from time to time when I can, but there's some really thoughtful, considered discussions, so it's always good to be here.
Well, let's continue to have those thoughtful, considered discussions. All these questions today, Minister, are coming from either the managing directors of the top development firms in Perth, a couple of people on your commission, directors, public and private, in the planning space as well. These are all coming from industry, and I'm so excited to hear that you're answering these. And the hot topic we can start off the bat on is something that I reckon there'd be very few people who'd be unhappy with you about when it comes to the R codes and simplifying them and opening up opportunities for mum and dads in this state to be a part of the solution as well. And that's the 50,000 new lots that you want to open up with your policy that essentially augments what R20 means when it comes to subdivision in this state. Can you explain to us your pitch of why you've done it and what your expectations are? How does it roll out and how does it affect mum and dads?
Yeah, well, look, I think Western Australia needs as much housing as it can. And anyone who's working in this space, so not the theorists, but people who actually practically work here, it's all parts of the continuum. So it's got to be greenfield, it's got to be infill and subdivisions, it's got to be medium and high density. We need it all to meet the demand. And so when you realise that, then you have to look at all the tools that you've got and enabling more infill, and I call it gentle density, so enabling more infill in already serviced areas seems to me quite a logical extension. So this is why, as part of our R code reforms, and it's part of a bigger package, which I think we all recognise has got very complex, is that typically for an R20 block, and look, got to be clear, I saw some commentary about this being lazy reform, which was pretty appalling commentary by Brad Pettit. This was a year load of work done by technical groups and stakeholder groups that had everyone around, plus the WA Planning Commission that made these recommendations to me. So there's been a body of work. And what the realisation was that at R20 it is a sweet spot. Where a 700 square metre block can't be subdivided, it could be under our reforms because you're scrapping the average lot size. Now,
that's a lot of blocks.
It is a lot of blocks, but look, you're not going to get 50,000 overnight. It's a choice. Ultimately, I do believe in private property rights. People have a decision whether they want to subdivide. If you want a big block, you can keep it. But if you want to subdivide, and this is particularly, I think, for intergenerational living, where a mum and dad may decide to subdivide and give the backlog to kids to build their own house, then we should enable it. We've got a choice here. We can't build to Geraldton because of the infrastructure costs associated with that. We do still need greenfield, but the reality is that this will help with land supply. And some people have said to me, stakeholders, you probably won't see the full results of this fruition in 5 to 10 years, but we've got to do it now.
Is it a case of we've been complaining about death by 1,000 cuts by putting some stitches in and starting to heal some of these the other way of it's not going to be the panacea, the silver bullet, but it's one more thing that I'm trying to implement amongst the suite of things since I became the minister that is at least pushing it in the right direction, and then the market can decide what happens from there?
Yeah, and of course this is just one part of the package. The R codes used to be 80 pages. They're now 300. And we do want more flexibility with infill. And so it has become very prescriptive. And so we are proposing changes to the front setbacks, how they're determined, to privacy requirements, and really trying to enable more clever infill development as well that allows people to think outside the box. And, why are we doing this? Well, the health check of our Peel and Perth plan basically has showed that we've still got a long way to go to reach the 47% target. There has been an improvement from 34% in 2023 to 39% in 2024, but we've got a long way to go. And we're doing everything else. Like, can I be very clear? We're doing the station precincts plan. We'll be upzoning significantly around 10 stations. I'm also, as every scheme is coming through, I am upzoning along transport corridors, activity centres to R60, to R80, to R100. So I do support good, medium and high density. That's a part of the solution, but I believe this is too.
Now, one of the critics is Brad Pettit, and his point, as you said, he said it was lazy. And I think there's two parts of it that I think you can talk to or explain to the listeners here. One is the obvious angle from the Greens that it is going to see less trees in our canopy. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because someone who's done over 100 of these, I do recognise I've cut down a few trees, putting a house behind a house. Hand up, right? And I think that flies in the face of what a lot of the local governments have been trying to implement around their policies. How does it work with that? How do you interface this with that? And then secondly, I guess the other criticism is if you're going to go put a house behind a house, that makes it a lot harder one day, given the capital value there now, to then turn that into a medium density in the future. How do we answer those two criticisms from the Greens?
The problem I have with the Greens is, what is their solution? Because they're saying it's got to be medium density, etc. Well, if that is their solution to housing supply, then we're damned, because it is all of the continuum. You need greenfield. Yes, we need medium to high density. We also need these reforms. And this is the truth of the Greens. Brad Pettit never, ever will have to implement in a pragmatic way any of these policies. So you can take the hypothetical. But the irony was, he was sprouting on social media this week how this project of student accommodation in Fremantle was coming online. It had taken successive mayors and it was a long process, but we finally got there. Yes, Brad, welcome to the construction market. This is what we face with every medium to high density project. We're doing that. We're doing these ARCO changes. We're doing the station precinct approach, which he also opposed, because he said it should be left to local governments. We can't trust some local governments because they are not upzoning enough to get that through.
But they're not on board, right?
No, they're not on board.
So how do you tackle then that local government policy that seems to be sweeping across the state for good intentions and for better or worse, depending which side of the fence you are on, with regards to tree retention and how that essentially is a blocker to what you're trying to achieve here? What does the state government do about it?
I mean, I suppose I've been criticised both ways. So I was criticised for not putting it into scheme amendments, which I didn't support, because my view is that kind of approach should not be in planning schemes. It's way too rigid. Now, I do respect that there are local governments introducing a local planning policy. And as a side note, as part of our code reforms, what we're looking at is getting some of the medium density features. So if we're going to allow subdivision, at least have deep soil zones and some soft landscaping provisions, which I have to say a lot of people already do. I suppose our approach has been that if you're going to introduce, and I know you may disagree, Trent, but if you're going to introduce those measures, do it at a local planning policy. Why? Because it can be changed. And we have seen the case like Kalamunda. It brought in a policy, then it ran into trouble, and it was able to withdraw it. So our preference is, if you're going to do it, really do it through a local planning policy approach, because they can be amended or changed.
So you think they can work together?
Yeah, I do. And local planning policies give you more flexibility to change. If you put it into a scheme amendment, that process then to change it again is quite difficult. It's got to go through a longer process. So I think local planning policies give you flexibility. Of course, I want trees, but we've got to be pragmatic. And again, the Greens can't do it. If a tree is in the middle of a block, sometimes, yes, you can accommodate it, but sometimes you can't. And so we've got to also be pragmatic about this stuff.
Are there any suburbs that are sacred, that are protected in this space? For those listening and don't know the details, are we going to see all of these protected suburbs like Floret, for example, and Nedlands and Dalkeith and Fulbinia and Menora, are they all getting cut in half?
Look, what I've said is this, that if there is existing heritage protection in schemes, that will remain because they've been there. But I've also been on the public record, and this got people excited, I said, well, look, we've really got to start moving to make R30 the standard. That's the aspiration. I accept that there will be still areas in Perth at R20 and below, but you've got to be able to seriously justify it. I'm laying out a challenge. And you've got to remember, how does this process work? So schemes come up to me. The WAPC review them. They go out for consultation. My challenge to local governments is this. If you're going to do low density, you've got to prove why.
And where have you filled in the gaps in the rest of your local
that's
government?
right. And if you're going to justify R20 over here, where are you making it up in terms of R60 or R80? And what you are seeing at the moment, so for example with the Cambridge scheme, the WA Planning Commission said we need to upzone a lot more along transport corridors. So if you want that low density, show me how you're going to enable higher density. And this is the other thing which we know is the truth, is you zone, but again, in my view, you need to go strong with medium to high density along the transport corridors and activity centres because we know not all of it's going to be developed. This is the kind of error or the assumption by some is just because you upzone something, I've accepted.
It won't be 50,000.
No, but you've got to enable it.
Yeah.
And I've been upfront. You always use a projection, and I get criticised. Of course we use projections. I mean, Liberal governments have do this.
Well, you have to have some goals.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also people then start to realise, I mean, quite interestingly, nearly all the feedback I've had on this subdivision is, does it apply to my property?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of people who are wanting this, and so I really do believe that this will be important for land supply.
Honestly, for a lot of people on the ground, it's their only pathway to retirement without the Australian pension. It's the backyard that they've been looking after for 40 years, and being able to sell that thing off for $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, that's their super. And they're just sort of unlucky up until this point that they're sitting on a block that may be 800 square metres in R20. The second that's opened up, they'll be giving you a Christmas card, I think, John, in that sense, because without it, they'd have to move house and they'd lose all that in the first place to be able to downsize and then divest for the future. Because most people, as we know, a struggle for a few years now has been an inability to downsize, a lack of mobility, which is becoming less of a problem with stock on the market at the moment. You spoke about, and we know that you're looking into simplifying these R codes. How small and simple can it get? Can it be a 12-page document?
Well, I mean, I'm sure some people are dreaming of that. Look, what I would say as part of this, we're really trying, in effect, for someone who's not a planning geek, perhaps like us, is if you simplify the R codes, it means less things are triggered, which means that the chances are there is less requirement for a convoluted planning process. That's the ultimate aim of these changes, and it allows for more flexibility. And we really are focused on simplification. It doesn't mean we're throwing everything out and saying we don't want good design, but allowing simplification, we think, will help more homes get built faster.
So less prescriptive. And the funny thing is that the lack of prescription over time has led local governments who their officers are often not incentivised to take initiative and they're scared to make decisions that will have backlash without something behind them, has led to more prescription over the time that can stand behind. And that's, I think, the KPI for the decision maker, who's often not a leader in such of a business. There's someone making a normal wage, going home to their normal house and with a lot of pressure, right, to be able to have that book protect them, to be brave and to be progressive about solving this problem together. And I think that's where a lot of the culture is. It's fear of being progressive because they're not incentivized to be, and they're always worried about the retribution of stepping outside their lane. And one of the things that we see at local government level when you speak about trying to get application times from 60 to 30 days is that number looks nice on paper, but it never ends up being 60 anyway. It's 90 or 20 because of one very smart way that governments work, and that's to stop the clock. They ask for one piece of information from you that you can get back within a couple of days, stop the clock. They have a conversation now, stop the clock. And suddenly they've still met their 60 days, but it's 4 months down the track and you're waiting for your approval. How do we get around that?
Well, two things. First of all, there are some good local governments that are creating fast-track processes like Stirling and Bayswater who are really trying to change the culture. And you're right, it's ultimately a question of culture. And either it's a can-do attitude or the computer says no. And that can come down to the planning director, the CEO, the mayor, the whole way that a council operates. And there are good ones and there are bad ones. And I think everyone would acknowledge that. Secondly, we are working in this space, but it is a bigger challenge. It's public reporting. I know Walger and I occasionally come to blows, but I am having some good productive engagement with them. Ultimately, what I want to see is very clear public reporting of all the key metropolitan, so at least in Perth and Peel and the major regional centres, which captures that information, because at the moment I would suggest the voluntary self-reporting by some local governments, which doesn't, I believe, capture the stop the gap process or other referrals, because there is sometimes legitimate reasons where you need referral advice or stop the gap, but I don't want to see it abused. But one way is through detailed and very transparent public reporting of times, because we do want to encourage competition in local governments about their planning approval processes.
That's fantastic. And I think it is a big cultural thing. One of the next questions is from a director in one of the local governments. The car parking gamble, one of the things we're talking about is having less minimum parking, right? I can stand behind this question in a way in that I do love a lot of the variability that comes out of the free market outcomes of studio apartments with no car parking in those places. But there are a couple of examples where this was tried by local governments, like Rivervale and Nollamara, where you'd have the 6 walk-up apartments on a quarter acre. Maybe it was 1 car bay per apartment, and then the whole street is just street parking forever and a day. How do we solve that when that's a huge infrastructure problem that sort of, I don't know that there's an answer to in a way?
I'd say this first. I acknowledge greater density can bring more parking issues, traffic issues.
We're a car state still, aren't we?
But we're seeing that anyway. Regardless, we're growing population, more people can mean more cars. But that's why investment in Metronet and that massive 72-kilometre investment of rail has been really important, because we're opening up new transit nodes. But can I say that shouldn't be then used as an argument against density? And I also say this. We know that the cost of a car park is significant. There's been reports done that shows that we could be talking, I think, from memory, $100,000 and $150,000 adding to the cost of an apartment when you're adding in car bays. So if we want more medium and high density, we've got to think outside the box. And my point is we need to enable more of this. And so what I'm saying is I'm not forcing a developer to sell apartments without any car bays. Ultimately, the market will dictate.
Perfect. Yep.
And I believe, generally, you're going to see developers still realise they've got 2 apartments. They're probably still going to include 2 car bays because it's a partner or couple, both have a car, and to sell that product. But I'm giving choice. So if you want to do something a bit different, if it's targeted at young people, and we know some of the demographic trends about more young people aren't getting driver's licenses, using Uber or whatever. Students, then you can do that. And so you might have a situation where you've got a mixed-use development where you're selling some apartments with no car bays and then some apartments with the standard. So I believe the market will ultimately determine this. But, you know, whatever models we have in place, we still have to tackle congestion, which comes with just general population growth.
I don't think there's a person in this state who could ever criticise your energy or work ethic or intent to try and get outcomes in the fields that you're the minister of. But I think that there is also an obvious understanding, recognition across the industry and the leaders that you are hamstrung massively by underperforming infrastructure organisations. Water Corp, Western Power specifically have been a problem for you, I think, in rolling out your goals, your targets of thousands of properties. And we see it on the ground on a daily basis that even in places like East Wanneroo right now, there are thousands of lots ready to be developed and still no wastewater treatment plant, still no land even purchased for it. There are slabs that are going to be poured soon from Hesperia's development, Britannia Park. What conversations are being had? What heads need to roll for action to actually come out of the ground here in organisations like Water Corp and Western Power to make sure that your goals aren't being jeopardised and all the hard work you're doing around incentivising the market and facilitating the market, cutting red tape, to then just not be able to connect a toilet or plug the power in your house?
Well, you're right, Trent. Infrastructure is critically important because it opens up the land supply that we need. And there has been and is a concerted effort. And look, in the last budget, we put an extraordinary amount of money aside for both water and other infrastructure to unlock that land, particularly in the key corridor.
How does that translate, though?
So how that translates is, as a minister and with particularly the Deputy Premier, just to explain how we do operate. You've got Cabinet, and then we have a subcommittee of Cabinet that brings together the DP, Regional Development and myself, and then we have all the key agencies responsible for housing and land development. And then below that, and we get into the nitty-gritty, we have a priority corridor working group, which looks at all the growth corridors and the infrastructure requirements. And then we have technical groups that are trying to navigate through with the agencies and the developers about how we get those infrastructure across the line. Because can I be brutally honest
Please.
here? Yeah, like, part of the issue is, and it's so easy for the opposition and others to say, oh, you know, it's so easy to unlock land. But the reality is the land that we're now seeking to unlock, whether it's East Wanneroo, North Baldivis, these are a lot more complex. The old days where you just saw the land and it didn't have environmental rules, groundwater and drainage. Yeah. One of the biggest issues that I'm dealing with and with the Minister for Water is around groundwater management and drainage issues. So navigating that. And so there is a big effort in this space. So I understand. And I've got to also say this, Trent, and I say this respectfully. Governments have to do it at a strategic level because you might be investing in one part of the growth corridor here, and that's going to get you all these lots. We've got a big infrastructure investment program, but we're looking at where are the most strategic areas to get bang for buck, to get unlocked lots. And the only problem I face is, and this is the truth, and I don't think I'm saying anything, you'll probably smile, every land developer will look me in the eye and sometimes say, my project's most important, but my neighbours, don't worry about it. And that happens with groundwater. They say, look, you know, we can fix this groundwater or drainage issue here.
Yeah, someone else's problem.
But all it does, it moves the issue to the next developer who then comes in the next week and says to me, don't worry about that one.
Is there a close connection between yourself, the Deputy Premier, the new Minister for Water, obviously just finding his feet, and the hierarchy at the infrastructures? Is there a direct line to say, can you just buy that land and build that bloody thing?
Look, what I can assure you is this. There is an absolute concerted effort. And the Deputy Premier and I and the new Minister for Water, we don't just sit back, someone comes and meets with us. We get into the nitty-gritty of projects. We push the agencies to find solutions. And, I mean, you could also understand this. If you get advice from an agency that says this is going to be a critical flooding issue, you know, you've got to give it serious consideration. But you've got to also test it and say, right, we've got this alternative consultant. We've got this other advice. Let's test it to find a practical solution that gets that land developed.
I think the biggest concern for most is simply the lack of actual on-the-ground construction. We see the big numbers that say we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars towards something. You go, great, money's there now. And then you sit and you wait for shovels to hit the ground and pipes to be extended and plants to be built, and they don't. And we're moving along with our structure plans and getting our approvals and putting our money in the ground. And then 4 years later, there are still tankers moving people's sewerage out of their homes because Water Corp hasn't got to the party. They haven't used the money, let alone connected the lots up. And we just don't want to be a situation like Sydney Water, where lots are developed, people have houses, and well, to be honest, we're seeing it in Henley Brook anyway, but we can see it happening right in front of us in East Wanneroo, where this could have all been solved years ago, or even today, and 5 years now we're looking back going, if they only just bought that land and built that station like they said they were going to, that the money was there, and now we don't have the money anymore, we're in a deficit, what are we doing? It just feels like, feels like on the ground to developers, nothing's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a little bit unfair, Trent. I mean, We are getting infrastructure out of the ground, but I do respect your advocacy on this. All I can say is that we've always got to do better and improve. You never say, right, we draw a line in the sand, that's done, we've got always the best systems in place. My job as the Minister, with the Minister for Water in particular, is you've got to test the bureaucracy and the agencies and say, how do we get this out faster? We all understand the need to get infrastructure out faster. But the reality is there are still capacity constraints in the construction market or civic construction. But the message is received. We are working hard to get more infrastructure out the door.
I just think that of all the efforts that you're bringing in, the industry's bringing in, sewerage and power should never be the reason we don't meet our targets. That's probably, I guess, the overall thought. The housing diversity pipeline is something that was touted a couple of years ago as something that I thought was a fantastic initiative coming out of your office. I applauded it. I participated in it. We were successful in it for transparency. But it seems like we had, 50, 60 applications, and maybe half a dozen have actually been successful. I'm aware that ours was the first off the rank, just out of coincidence. I would like to think from Probity's perspective, clearly. It took 18 months to get that contract signed. This policy, this initiative was brought out to fast-track development. What's going on between your great intent and great policy and the realities between all the departments in between for us to still be going, well, we still haven't even settled on the land and I'm the first guy off the list?
But look, this program is unlocking 14 sites. But I would say this, developers came in and, I still have to get value for taxpayers. I can't just plonk out land that is not value for taxpayers. And the reality is there were plenty of developers through the second round that just
have a land.
A lot of people had a land.
Fair enough.
So I have to meet the requirements of proper valuations. And so really, while I respect the development industry, a lot of people just put in, my understanding was, very low bids. Some of these projects have gone to community housing providers. So they're leading housing projects and they're working through them. But even the issue for them, as everyone knows, is that they've been finding locking in a construction builder has been challenging. So we will continue to identify surplus land and we will continue to get surplus land out through a competitive process. But ultimately, as part of that, it was less about red tape and it was just about ultimately value for money.
Commercials.
Bingo.
That's fair, and that's a great answer.
And I'm guided by that.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. But I think whilst I 100% take that on board and I think that's a fantastically reasonable answer, it's a great example, if I can be a bit frank about it, how the red tape works in the government space, and that a genuine offer that was accepted with no real need for negotiation on my side took 18 months. I mean, there's no other way in a commercial space where that would have even been reasonably expected. We could have got most of that developed in that time. And I think this is some feedback. You wouldn't even need to respond to it. I reckon if you're doing a HDP3, there has to be a way to do that quicker for us to be able to help you quicker, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand.
From a social housing perspective, the goal, I think, is to hit 6% generally on our social housing. We're not there yet. Is there a target in your team of we reckon we'll get to that at this point, or it's not really a priority? I don't mean that facetiously. What's the goal in that space as an update, just so everyone knows? So
I became the Minister in 2021. I set a target within 4 years of 3,300 social homes. I met that. I set second target at the last election of 1,000 for 2 successive years, and I made that with around 1,030 in the first year and 970 in the second. So the average was 1,000 a year. So we made those targets. I've set a new target now of 9,800 homes. We're around more than 4,200 social and affordable homes. And why am I including affordable rentals in that? So this is the reality is because of the HAF, and there is HAF targets, which everyone's working to.
And you want to get that money?
Yeah. And no state is reaching the HAF target. And I'm not surprised by that given construction constraints, but we're coming second after Victoria. But we are doing an unprecedented number of build-to-rent projects. And build-to-rent projects which receive HAF funding effectively have a mix of social and affordable rentals. That's why now we're including affordable rentals in our number, because we're actually making them happen. So there's at least 30 social and affordable rental projects that are now being enabled by our state government, which is pretty incredible. You haven't seen that before. So I'm pretty proud. Look, part of the challenge, I have to say, is that, and I said this respectfully, I understand change is difficult, but the old way of creating a suburb of social and affordable housing is dead. We don't do that anymore. You've got to integrate these build-to-rent projects across communities. And what's really interesting is now wherever we propose them, you are getting community pushback. So you get people saying, I don't want it.
That's not surprising.
It's not. I understand people's fear of change. I understand. But the new model, it's not like the old Bentley Tower where it was 100% public housing. This is, in most cases, a mix, and it's managed by a community housing provider, and they also are given some greater flexibility about tenants making sure it works with the model. So it is a different way of doing things, but I understand that with change, it can be challenging.
Does that mean, just given one, the commercials of it across the board, not just for affordable, but two, the pushback, that John Carey has to be Perth's biggest apartment developer?
Well, interestingly, I saw Urbis did a study that said by 2028, a third of the apartment construction market would be social and affordable projects.
Well, that would be right then. That would mean the government... I think that's nearly your role. At the moment, what we know is when market fails, and there is definitely market failure in the apartment market that is not Western suburbs, government has to step in. Whether you're socialist or capitalist, I think we all agree on that, right?
This is the funny thing. I think the Greens don't get it. They go, why didn't that development get built yesterday? We all know doing a medium to high density project can take 2-3 years.
5 years.
Yeah, bingo, based on viability, construction, and it's a very difficult process. And then I've got Sandra Brewer and her team saying to residents, oppose the social and affordable build to rent project. So I've got both sides, one saying don't do it, the other side, you didn't do it yesterday. These are difficult projects, whether it's private or public sector. But the difference is with the public sector, we can take the risk because we're not worried about profitability. We're worried about just making sure they're delivered for value for taxpayers' money. Yes.
What's that test? It's going to cost us a lot more to house these people in emergency housing.
Having people sleeping rough on the street is more expensive because they end up in the public health system. And different projects, there's not a magic figure because if you're building in the regions, that's a very different proposition from building an apartment. But we do still look for value for money. I'm not just going willy-nilly with projects, but you're right. We have market failure. And when you have market failure, if I do not intervene with these build-to-rent projects, then no one else is going to provide the housing and you're going to have a lot more people rough sleeping.
A few quick fire questions. Personal one. The state government land on Watley next to the underpass, Maylands East Perth area, that was in the first housing diversity pipeline. That's been sitting empty for a while now. Yeah. Great site. What's happening there?
So that is a project led by Bethany. They got their DA and now they're working through builders. People see a site, a big proportion of the build to rent projects are by the community housing sector. That means we provide support, we provide planning support, we provide the funds. But these community housing providers are directly responsible for the management and delivery of the projects. Bingo. So foundation housing, community housing have projects, housing choices. And so some of the model, if you go to Pearce Street, we're building it. There's 14 being done as part of the first tranche, being done by Development WA. So in some cases, the state builds it and then we sell it to the community housing provider. And of course, they use financing plus money from the feds through the HAF. The other approach, which is also included in my numbers, is the community housing provider is the developer and the driver of the project. My role is just supporting. And the issue is, I deeply respect Bethany. They've got a gun-ho CEO. But the community housing sector is subject to the same issues as the private housing sector. working through designs, working through costs, finding a viable builder. So when people are criticising that site, they're not criticising the government, they're criticising a community housing provider. I say, yes, we want that to get that project over the line, but give them a fair crack. They are facing the exact same issues that a private developer is.
I assume they've got sunset dates like a lot of other people, that if they don't get cracking, you'll take it on?
Yeah, but we want them. The view and understanding is you need the community housing sector to grow. We've actually created a $6 million grants program to help bolster the capacity. And there are projects already well underway and being delivered by the community housing sector. And why do we want them to grow? Because they actually save taxpayers money, because they get financing, they use low-cost loans, they get money from the federal government. So every community housing project can be a saving to WA taxpayers, because we put less in, which means we can help that project there, we can help this project over here, because they're using levers that we can't necessarily draw on.
Okay. The Freo line has had a lot of controversy recently with the train station plan you've had.
Yep.
If you take it even further and you get a little bit more radical, you drop that train line and you've got hectares of land that could be developed into high-density housing right on top of a train line, and there's your walk score straight away. Is there a future that we're alive in that timeline where that might even happen?
Trent, I'm a straight shooter. I don't think so. And the reason is that we've got so many brownfield sites we're trying to unlock that I would rather use the money to continue to unlock some of those areas rather than... I mean, I'll obviously always support the aspiration of undergrounding rail, and the Minister for Transport's done an extraordinary job with Metronet, but I support that aspiration as someone who's passionate about more density. But I think through our station precinct plan, and here's the tip, I'll be announcing the core and transition zones very soon. I think already there's enough that we can unlock. So it might happen in the future under a government, but if I'm going to use additional funds, I want to unlock existing brownfield sites that perhaps have constraints.
Lower hanging fruit is what you're saying. Across the state, across the metro area, is there an area that straight away in your head go, I'd love to see that gentrified, I'd love to see that renewed, that's low-hanging fruit in terms of just a geographical location? So
one of the things that I know there's a lot of aspiration is Morley. I really think...
I'm a Morley boy.
Yeah, there is so much potential, and I know there's a lot of controversy around the Galleria redevelopment, and it's getting a redevelopment, but I think there's so much potential there. And actually, just as a side note, my neighbour opened a cafe there that was very cool and hipster, and I was blown away by the number of people that turned up. Because a lot of different demographics are moving in there, I think Morley has so much potential and a lot more potential for mixed-use development as well. And if you know it, there's a lot of existing area, like where the old Bunnings site is, that you look at these older restaurants and you think in the future, by God, this could be fantastic for medium and high density. Yeah. So for me, Morley is an area that I aspire to see medium and high density.
Well, it's supported by 2 train stations as well, so that's a big help.
And great close location.
Exactly right. My mum will be happy about that. If you could wave your magic wand, and you've spoken about that many times in the past, I've yet to see it though, and have something be created or removed in an instant, something that you'd want or something you just want to get rid of straight away to make your job far more efficient, what would it be?
I know everyone expects me to say local government, which is completely unfair because I was a local government minister. You know, look, I do respect that there are really good local governments, but I also understand that there are problematic ones, and we're seeing a lot in the media. And I suppose what I would say is everyone says, just rationalise and amalgamate local governments. We had a former premier that tried to do it.
A Liberal one.
Yeah, a Liberal one. It was a pretty dismal failure. And I was a mayor who actually said, no, amalgamate all of us. The chances of that happening have gone. But if I had a magic wand, I would strongly wish that all these local governments came together to create a major new central local government for at least the Perth area. And it's interesting because when I said this before and I said Vincent should merge to Perth, I had some people push back on me, including local constituents. But actually when I went into it and then talked about the efficiencies and for ratepayers, a lot of people went, actually, yeah, I wouldn't mind having a second look at it. So I think people some ways get terrified. But if I had a magical wand, it would be that all these local governments come together and decide they're voluntarily going to merge into bigger local governments that provide greater rationality. And my other thing is just for elected officials to get along in local governments. It's not Parliament, and people need to understand this. Parliament is set up as an environment where the opposition challenges us, there's question time, there's committees, there's inquiries, there's questions on notice. People don't realise local government is not meant to be like that. It's a board. It's not meant to be partisan. You're not meant to have 2 or 3 groups at each other's throat. It is a board. The mayor is the chair. They're trying to be inclusive. You agree on a vision. You work to it. You can still have differences.
I'm trying to think of one of those that
well,
like that.
I think the current Vincent Mayor and her team, while they have policy differences, they do have a vision and they do work to it. So I do think there are some councils that seek to do that recognise their role as a board. They're not the Parliament.
Yeah.
And that's where we get confused.
Why do you say that the opportunity for that is passed? Because I reckon 90% of constituents would agree with you, and that the people who are against it are mainly people protecting their patch or their job that would be duplicated. You're in a government that is as powerful as government's been in our lifetimes in terms of the numbers. You could get away with a lot more than you do right now when it comes to reform. Why doesn't it happen?
So, Trent, the reality is the way the Day-Door Amendment works is you have to meet a certain percentage of people to get an agreement. And that's actually far more difficult because you actually don't. And what I do find is that often in local government, a silent majority don't vote. They don't engage. So the people that perhaps have a gripe or are angry or what else may vote. There are really good people who do vote and say, I'm active.
That's like every DA, to be honest.
Well, I'll leave that to your assessment. But I suppose the point is the mechanism in the Local Government Act is actually not there and conducive to
So you can't wave your magic wand.
You could have changed the laws and then you could seek to pass it. I just suppose I would say I don't think there's consensus. We do not control the upper house. So I don't know where the Liberals and Greens would sit. But ultimately, it's a lot of political capital to spend. And I just think that if we can keep with our planning reforms, which is more about consistency, standardisation, so it doesn't matter which local government you're in, the rules are a standard. For me, as the Housing and Planning Minister, that's most important.
2 more questions. Is there anything else on the table for reforms coming up? This one's come from a commissioner.
Well, isn't that naughty that commissioner is doing that?
And this is a side note to it. Will there be a future where a single dwelling never needs a DA?
Well, that would be my aspiration. And hopefully my changes to the R codes will mean more of that. But when something triggers so many variations, it requires a consultation. Look.
What's coming up?
So by the time you listen to this program, hopefully I have not passed, but I'll have announced the station precincts, the cores and the zones. And also I will be announcing very soon other reforms around basically structure planning and MRS, around land development, and also some other work around approvals. So more is coming. I think, I've been criticised. I remember at the last election, I had the Liberals, it was quite unbelievable. One spokesperson said, we'll do a review of John Carey's changes, and the other in a debate said, we have fatigue with planning reform and we shouldn't have any more. This is from the Liberal Party. Absolutely said. Neil Thompson and Steve Martin. You can't make that up.
Well, that's caused a lot of issues for the whole industry, to be honest, all of this kerfuffle.
Yeah, so the reality is we've got to keep going. And interestingly, if the reforms are about making a system simpler and easier or reducing red tape, then why would you be opposing it? Yes, you have to adjust. But what I find about private market is they have to make changes all the time. A viability of a project, they have to make quick decisions, and uncertainty with the Iran war, etc. So I find that the private sector is very well placed and accustomed to reform and change because they have to adjust to a changing environment all the time. So yes, more reform is coming. Some of it will require changes to the Planning Act. Others will be through regulation and others will relate to how my agencies refer matters off to other agencies.
Last question, personal question. Do you still love what you do? And after a few years in now, after clearly working your ass off, do you think you are making the difference you hoped you would have?
Look, I mean, ultimately that's a decision for others to judge. But I do want to say this. I give this job my all. It's 24/7. I'm not someone who just sits back and sets a policy direction. And I have an open door policy. I meet with a whole range of different stakeholders and I genuinely try to fix issues. Now, there are issues outside of my control that I'll never fix, but I do hope people can see that I'm continuing to drive reform. You know, I get into the nitty-gritty. A community housing project's facing challenges. I'll get briefings. I'll get in there. I'll say, right, well, how do we fix this? Is it financing? What's the hold up? And I have to say this, I know on the social and affordable housing side that I've delivered more than 4,000 social homes, which means there are thousands of either singles or couples or families of people who are living in secure housing. So,
that's got to keep you going.
Yeah, it does, but there's always more to do. And politics and partisan politics sucks because people say, oh, you failed here or you didn't do that. I've never said that every policy measure that I do will produce the same level of results. But it is the combination of everything that gets you these results. And had we not made the changes in planning reform, for example, then I'm sure that the level of housing approvals and constructions wouldn't be where it's at. Doesn't mean that I don't want more and I'm going to fight for more, but you take the wins. When something doesn't work, you get in there, you try to rework it, or you accept that policy measure isn't enough, but can we consider something else?
Didn't answer my question. Do you still love it?
I love it. Yeah, I do love it, but it's tough and it should be tough. You know, I'm a minister. There's no sorrow or sympathy for me. I decided to pick this occupation. I'm not asking for anyone to get out a little violin. Ministers deserve scrutiny. They deserve a tough working environment. I love it. I give everything at it and I'll just keep going until, as my dad said, one day you're a rooster, the next day you're a feather duster. The people put you in. One day they'll decide to throw you out. Time is limited. Give it your all.
Thanks so much for your time today, and thanks so much for walking those streets and your constituency like no other, Minister Carey. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Perth Property Show. If you've only just joined the conversation, you can catch up by heading over to our website, perthpropertyshow.com.au, subscribing to the podcast, or joining our Facebook page. Don't forget to tune in next Monday at 7 a.m. for more expert insights, local analysis, and suburb spotlights. Happy hunting!